In January 1991, the Soviet Union's Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov announced a monetary reform. He gave citizens 3 days, January 23 to 25, to exchange their 50 and 100 ruble notes for smaller denominations. The limit was 1,000 rubles. Everything beyond that? Gone. The government planned to remove 81 billion rubles from circulation to control inflation. It failed. Spectacularly. Money was thrown to the wind, tossed away, burned. Only 14 billion rubles were actually removed from circulation. By April 1991, just 3 months later, the average Soviet salary of 330 rubles was worth $12 on the international market. By December 1991, 11 months after Pavlov's reform, the ruble had depreciated to nearly 100 rubles per dollar. The Soviet Union ceased to exist on December 26, 1991. The ruble, a currency that had once been declared stronger than the dollar, was worth less than the paper it was printed on. But here is what they do not teach you in school: this was not a sudden catastrophe. This was the final act of a currency that had been dying for decades, propped up by denial, political inertia, and the refusal to acknowledge that the mathematics of empire simply did not add up anymore. The Soviet ruble is not just history. It is a pattern. And that pattern is repeating right now. In March 1950, the Soviet Union made a declaration that stunned the West. The ruble was revalued. The official exchange rate was set at 4 rubles to $1, based on a declared gold content of the ruble. This was not just monetary policy. This was a statement of power. The Soviet Union was announcing that its currency was backed by gold, by production, by the might of the world's second superpower. For the preferential rate that had existed until June 30, 1950, 6 rubles per dollar, there would now be only one rate, 4 to 1. The ruble was being positioned as an international currency. And for a time, it worked. The Soviet Union controlled not just its own economy but the economies of an entire bloc. Through the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, the ruble became the settlement currency for trade across Eastern Europe and beyond. Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Mongolia, Cuba, Vietnam, all of them traded in rubles. The system was called the transferable ruble, and it functioned as the Eastern Bloc's answer to the Bretton Woods system that governed Western currencies. The genius of the system was simple: control. The Soviet Union controlled the prices, controlled the trade flows, controlled who could buy what and when. There was no free market to challenge the official exchange rate. There was no need for the ruble to compete on global markets because the global market, for 1/3 of the world's population, was denominated in rubles. If you wanted Soviet oil, Soviet steel, Soviet technology, you paid in rubles. If you were a satellite state and wanted to trade with your neighbors, you used rubles. The currency was not backed by market confidence. It was backed by political and military dominance. By 1971, the official exchange rate had shifted to 0.90 rubles per dollar, making the ruble appear even stronger than before. The Soviet Union maintained this illusion of strength through the 1970s, even as oil prices soared and Soviet exports flooded the world with energy. The official rate in the late 1970s hovered around 0.66 to 0.75 rubles per dollar. To the outside world, the Soviet Union looked like an economic juggernaut. Its currency seemed invincible. But there was a problem. None of it was real. The Soviet Union had built its currency on a foundation of 3 pillars: oil revenue, gold reserves, and political control. By the early 1980s, all 3 were beginning to crumble. First, gold. The Soviet Union had long been one of the world's largest gold producers, and it used gold sales to finance imports of technology and grain from the West. In the early 1980s, the Soviets had built up their gold reserves, and stockpiles were substantial. But then 2 things happened. Gold production growth slowed dramatically, from over 3% per year for decades to less than 2% annually during 1981 to 1985. The reason was simple: the gold content of mined ore was declining sharply, particularly in the northeast region, which accounted for much of Soviet output. Production costs were rising, and output was falling. At the same time, the world gold price collapsed. Between 1981 and 1985, the falling price of gold devalued Soviet reserves by $9 billion. The Soviet Union was caught in what analysts called a double whammy: falling production and falling prices. The value of its strategic reserves was evaporating. Second, oil. Soviet power in the 1970s had been built on high oil prices. But in the mid-1980s, oil prices collapsed. The revenue that had financed the empire, the military, and the subsidies that kept satellite states loyal, all of it dried up. The Soviet Union had no diversified economy to fall back on. It had oil, gas, gold, and weapons. When the prices of the first three fell, the fourth became irrelevant. Third, political control. The system of trade within Comecon was breaking down. The satellite states were no longer willing to trade in a currency that had no real value. They wanted hard currency: dollars, marks, yen. The transferable ruble, which had once been the backbone of Eastern Bloc trade, was becoming a joke. Countries were forced to engage in barter because the ruble could not buy anything outside the Soviet sphere. The currency that had once settled trade across a third of the world was now a cage, trapping nations inside an economic system that no longer functioned. By 1990, the official exchange rate was still listed as 0.61 rubles per dollar. But on the black market, dollars were changing hands at 20 rubles. The gap between official and reality was no longer a difference of opinion. It was a chasm. The Soviet government maintained the official rate through force, through controls on currency exchange, through laws that made it illegal for citizens to own foreign currency. But laws cannot change mathematics. And the mathematics were screaming. In November 1989, the Soviet Union finally acknowledged what everyone already knew. The ruble was devalued for foreign travel to a tourist rate of 6.26 per dollar, compared to the official rate of 0.63. It was a small admission, but it was an admission nonetheless. The ruble was not worth what the government claimed. 1 year later, in November 1990, the government introduced a new commercial exchange rate of 1.80 rubles per dollar. But even this was a fantasy. Black market dollars were trading at 20 rubles. The government was still pretending that the ruble had value, even as everyone who needed to conduct real business knew it did not. Then came Valentin Pavlov. Appointed Prime Minister in January 1991, Pavlov was tasked with fixing the unfixable. His solution was the monetary reform of January 1991. Withdraw the largest bills. Force citizens to exchange them within 3 days. Limit the amount they could exchange. Remove 81 billion rubles from circulation and solve the inflation problem. It was a disaster. Citizens panicked. They burned money. They threw it away. They spent it on anything they could find because holding rubles was the same as holding nothing. Only 14 billion rubles were removed from circulation, nowhere near the 81 billion target. Worse, the reform destroyed what little trust remained in the Soviet government. If the state could declare your savings worthless overnight, what was the point of saving at all? By April 1991, following the failed reform, the tourist exchange rate was raised to 27.60 rubles per dollar. The average monthly Soviet salary of 330 rubles was now worth $12 on the international market. $12. For a month of work. In a superpower. The government raised prices on April 2, 1991, in a desperate attempt to close a budget deficit of 31 billion rubles. The deficit existed because the republics, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, the Central Asian republics, had stopped transferring money to Moscow. By April 1991, the collective debts of the Soviet republics to the federal government had reached 36 billion rubles. They had no money to transfer, and they had no intention of sending what little they had to a government they no longer respected. The empire was not just economically insolvent. It was politically dissolved. But the currency still existed. And the leadership still believed they could save it. On August 19, 1991, hardliners in the Communist Party attempted a coup. They wanted to stop the reforms, to preserve the Soviet Union, to restore the old order. The coup failed within 3 days. Boris Yeltsin, standing on a tank outside the Russian parliament, denounced the right-wing, reactionary, anti-constitutional coup d'état. 3 civilians were killed. The coup collapsed not because of military strength but because of weakness, indecision, and, according to some accounts, the alcoholism of its instigators. The coup broke the Soviet Union. Within days, it was clear the Union would not survive. By October 1991, the ruble was trading at 35 to 40 on the black market and 45 to 70 in government auctions. Gold reserves, which had been estimated at 4,000 tons in 1990, had fallen to between 1,000 and 1,200 tons by 1991. The Soviet state was on the verge of bankruptcy, unable to pay its debts. The credit system had been destroyed. External state debt was skyrocketing. On December 8, 1991, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine declared that the USSR as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality ceases its existence. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. 1 day later, on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved. By early December 1991, just before the dissolution, the ruble had depreciated to nearly 100 rubles per dollar. A currency that had once been declared stronger than the dollar, that had settled trade across a third of the globe, that had been backed by gold and oil and the might of a superpower, was now worthless. On January 1, 1991, the countries of Comecon shifted their trade dealings to a hard currency market basis. The transferable ruble was abandoned. The result was a radical decrease in trade within the Eastern Bloc. Nations that had been forced to trade in rubles for decades suddenly had nothing to trade with. The currency that had held the system together was gone, and the system itself evaporated. The Soviet ruble did not collapse because of a military defeat. It did not collapse because of a revolution. It collapsed because the mathematics stopped working. The currency had been propped up by political force, by control over trade, by the illusion that the state could declare value into existence. When the political force disappeared, when the control broke, when the illusion shattered, there was nothing left. The ruble was revealed for what it had always been, a claim on an economy that did not exist. The collapse took 40 years. But the final act took 11 months. From January 1991, when Pavlov attempted his reform, to December 1991, when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, the ruble went from a currency that was supposed to solve inflation to a currency that was worth less than 1% of its official value. 40 years of denial. 11 months of collapse. Now, here is what should terrify you. The pattern is not unique to the Soviet ruble. It is the pattern of every reserve currency that has ever collapsed. And the same pattern is visible today in the currencies that dominate the global economy. Consider the mechanism. The Soviet ruble was a reserve currency for 1/3 of the world. It was used because nations had no choice. If you wanted to trade within the Eastern Bloc, you used rubles. The currency was not backed by economic fundamentals. It was backed by political control. The Soviet Union did not need market confidence because it controlled the market. The United States dollar is the reserve currency for the global economy. It is used because nations have no choice. If you want to trade oil, you use dollars. If you want to access global financial markets, you use dollars. If you want to settle international debts, you use dollars. The currency is not backed by gold, that link was severed in 1971. It is backed by political control. The United States does not need market confidence in the traditional sense because it controls the market. The Soviet Union ran deficits that it could not finance. The republic stopped transferring money to the federal government. The budget deficit reached 31 billion rubles, and the collective debts of the republics reached 36 billion. The federal government had no way to close the gap except by printing money and raising prices. Inflation spiraled out of control. The United States runs deficits that it finances by issuing debt. The federal debt exceeds $30 trillion. The deficit is measured in trillions per year. The government closes the gap by issuing treasury bonds, which are purchased by foreign governments, pension funds, and, increasingly, by the Federal Reserve itself. Inflation, after decades of being suppressed, has returned. The gap between official inflation statistics and the lived experience of citizens is widening. The Soviet Union tried to fix the problem with monetary reforms. Withdraw the large bills. Limit what citizens can exchange. Control the money supply. It failed because the problem was not the money supply. The problem was that the economy could not produce enough value to justify the currency. When citizens lost faith in the currency, no amount of control could restore it. Central banks today are trying to fix the problem with monetary policy. Raise interest rates. Tighten the money supply. Control inflation. But the problem is not just the money supply. The problem is that the debt is too large, the deficits are too large, and the productive capacity of the economy is not growing fast enough to justify the value of the currency. When confidence breaks, when the gap between official rates and reality becomes too wide to ignore, no amount of policy can restore it. The Soviet ruble maintained an official exchange rate of 0.61 per dollar while the black market rate was 20 to 1. The gap was more than 30 times. The official rate was a lie, maintained by force and by laws that made it illegal to own foreign currency. When the laws could no longer be enforced, the official rate collapsed to match reality. Today, official inflation statistics in major economies often diverge sharply from what citizens experience in housing, food, energy, and healthcare. The gap is not 30 times, but it is growing. The official narrative is that inflation is under control, that interest rates will normalize, that the currency is sound. But the mathematics are becoming harder to ignore. Debt to GDP ratios are at levels historically associated with crises. Real wages are stagnating or declining. The cost of living is rising faster than incomes. The Soviet Union dissolved not because of military defeat but because the republic stopped believing in the Union. Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia itself declared that the USSR had ceased to exist. The political structure dissolved before the economic structure could be reformed. The currency followed. The global reserve currency system is held together not by economic fundamentals but by political agreements. The Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971 when the U.S. could no longer maintain the gold standard. The petrodollar system has held since the 1970s because oil is priced in dollars. But geopolitical shifts are challenging that system. Nations are increasingly trading in their own currencies. Agreements are being made to bypass the dollar. The political structure that holds the reserve currency system together is weakening. The Soviet Union's gold reserves fell from 4,000 tons to 1,200 tons in a single year. The state was on the verge of bankruptcy. It could not pay its debts. The currency collapsed because there was nothing backing it except the promise of a state that no longer existed. Central banks today hold reserves, but those reserves are increasingly in the form of other fiat currencies or financial assets, not gold or productive capacity. When one reserve currency weakens, the others weaken with it because they are all part of the same system. The promise backing the currency is the promise of a government to tax future production. But if future production does not materialize, if debt grows faster than GDP, if the tax base shrinks, the promise becomes worthless. This is not a prediction. This is a pattern. And patterns do not ask permission to repeat. The Soviet ruble collapsed in 11 months. From January to December 1991, the currency went from official respectability to worthlessness. 40 years of denial compressed into 11 months of panic. When it happened, citizens were not prepared. The government had told them the currency was sound. The official exchange rate was published every day. The state maintained price controls. The leadership gave speeches about reform and recovery. And then, in a span of weeks, it was over. The people who suffered most were the ones who believed. The ones who kept their savings in rubles. The ones who did not, or could not, buy foreign currency on the black market. The ones who trusted that the state would protect them. By December 1991, their savings were worthless. A lifetime of work, erased. The people who survived were the ones who saw the pattern. The ones who understood that official exchange rates are not reality, that political control is not economic strength, that promises from a bankrupt state are not worth the paper they are printed on. They bought dollars. They bought gold. They moved their wealth into assets that existed outside the system. And when the collapse came, they were ready. The choice is always the same. Believe in the system, or believe in the mathematics. Trust the official narrative, or trust the pattern. History does not repeat itself because history wants to. It repeats itself because human behavior is consistent. Leaders deny reality. Systems maintain illusions. Citizens trust institutions. And when the mathematics finally become too loud to ignore, the collapse happens faster than anyone expected. The Soviet Union lasted 70 years. The collapse took 11 months. The British pound was the global reserve currency for over a century. The transition to the dollar took less than 30 years, accelerated by 2 world wars. The Spanish real de ocho was the first global currency. It collapsed when Spain debased it to finance empire. Every reserve currency in history has collapsed. Not some. All. The question is not whether the current system will collapse. The pattern guarantees it will. The question is, what will you do when it does? Most people will do nothing. They will wait for the government to fix it. They will trust that the central bank knows what it is doing. They will believe the official statistics, the press conferences, the reassurances. And when the collapse comes, they will be unprepared. Their savings will evaporate. Their pensions will become worthless. Their currency will buy less and less, and then almost nothing. A small number will see the pattern. They will move their wealth into assets that are not dependent on the promises of a bankrupt state. They will diversify out of fiat currencies. They will prepare for the reality that the official narrative denies. And when the collapse comes, they will survive. The Soviet ruble was everywhere. And then it was nowhere. The transition took 11 months. The timeline is closing. The choice is yours.